From the start, I knew we could never find something magic in the way that you move. Oh, what a shame we could never feel the pain that our past tried to put in our view. This feeling, it surrounds me, oh, turning me around till I lose control. This feeling, it surrounds me, oh, I can see the sun is shining on your soul, so let's keep it. Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the second Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. Today we have a presentation on the power in racial equity impact statements. So I really appreciate you joining us and spending some time with Voices, the Racial Truth and Reconciliation Network, the Trauma Informed Community Networks, and our partners here today, the Commonwealth Institute as well. Today we have some slides and information to share with you. You'll have the chance to drop questions into the chat on Facebook and YouTube, and we'll be able to answer those questions as we go along today. And I really appreciate everyone who is tuning in to listen this morning or this afternoon. Voices for Virginia's Children, we're a statewide multi-issue organization committed to improving and protecting the lives of Virginia's children, youth, and families. Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia is an initiative of Voices that fits within our mission to promote more equitable opportunities for Virginia's children and families. This is the second Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week in Virginia, and we have a number of opportunities throughout the week for you to engage, to connect with other advocates, to connect with your families, and share this information with other folks in your community. So we encourage you to take a look at our website at vakids.org and participate in other events throughout this week as well. Next, I want to introduce our panel. I'm Emily Griffey, the Chief Policy Officer at Voices for Virginia's Children, and I'm going to turn it over to our other panelists today. Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Wisely, and I'm the Summer Policy Intern for Voices, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kelsey.
Hi, my name is Kelsey, and I'm the Data and Research Intern for Voices for Virginia's Children.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ashley Kenneth, and I'm the President and CEO at the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis.
Thank you all for being here today to share this information on racial equity impact statements. This is a really powerful portion of a tool in our policy analysis, data analysis, and advocacy that we can use to better inform outcomes and policies for children. Today, you are going to hear a little about the history of racial impact statements so you can better understand why they began and how they can be used. We want you to better understand what to look for in a racial equity impact statement and the work that went into creating that statement. The background, collecting information from folks who are impacted, the data analysis, and the policy analysis that went into that work. We also want you to be able to understand where you might be able to find and access racial equity impact statements in doing your advocacy or in reading about children's policy issues, and what to look for in racial equity impact statements that might be prepared for you or hopefully prepared by our legislative bodies in the future. The importance of these statements is that they can be used as a tool against institutionalized or systemic racism to identify where policies are out of line and do not benefit all children, particularly children of Black and Brown communities. One of the things that can be asked about racial impact statements is really looking to answer the question of who benefits and who burdens from the proposed policy. And one of the things that we want to get at in terms of equity is to ensure that all children have access to those equitable opportunities and that no additional group is additionally burdened. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Ashley from the Commonwealth Institute to talk a little bit about the background and history of racial equity impact statement.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Again, I'm Ashley Kenneth. I'm the president and CEO at the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. We are a nonprofit organization in Virginia that advances racial and economic equity by advocating for public policies that are designed in partnership with people who are most impacted by the issues and shaped by credible, accessible fiscal and policy research. Our independent research and analysis at TCI drives key state budget, legislative, and policy changes that break down barriers and create opportunity for people and communities across Virginia. A bit later in the presentation, we'll talk more about TCI's internal process in terms of using racial equity impact statements in our own research and analysis. But I'm excited first to dive into the basics and the background with Emily, Katie, and Kelsey. I first learned about racial equity impact assessments when I was in graduate school, and I was researching policy alternatives to incarceration. Indeed, criminal justice reform is where the use of racial equity impact statements has become most prevalent in the United States. In 2007, the Sentencing Project, who has been a leader in the movement for establishing racial equity impact requirements across the country, released a report that revealed Iowa had the greatest racial disparities in regards to their prison population. And in 2008, Iowa then became one of the first states to pass a law that requires that correctional impact statements also include minority impact statements prior to any floor debates on criminal justice legislation in order to actively work on the issue and to reverse the trend that they were seeing in their state. That really set the tone for a number of other states and localities to come. But the concept of these statements or assessments has in fact been around a long time. For example, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 required environmental impact assessments in order to anticipate the positive as well as the negative environmental effects of proposed policy decisions. Before that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 required that the US Department of Justice pre-clear any attempt to change voting laws that would disenfranchise people of color in several states in order to prevent harmful legislation from being enacted. And then, of course, states and localities often use the fiscal impact assessments to determine how a proposed policy decision may influence the bottom line or the budget. And the United States is not the only country to use these types of statements. The United Kingdom passed the Race Relations Act in 2000, which requires government agencies to use racial equality impact assessments for all proposed legislation. But the concept is gaining traction here in the United States, and racial equity impact statements or assessment requirements are being implemented in several states and localities for a variety of purposes. It's a policymaking tool that just makes sense. The assessments help educate lawmakers and inform decision-making. They proactively help prevent seemingly race-neutral laws from passing and therefore sparing potential harm. They help to center impacts to people in our state instead of just financial impacts. And they're especially important because it's easier to modify legislation rather than reversing a law at a later date. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie, who will talk a bit more about where we're seeing these tools used across the country.
Great, thank you. So like Ashley said, I'm going to speak a little bit about states who have racial equity impact legislation, what they're using it for, and what we're kind of seeing as the trends as more states take this legislation on. So currently only 10 states have passed legislation related to racial equity impact statements. Several more have proposals that just haven't gotten through. So hopefully in the coming years, we'll see those become more popular, gain more traction throughout the rest of the United States. Most of those statements do relate directly to criminal justice legislation, though notably, Oregon does allow lawmakers to request assessments on any criminal justice and child welfare legislation. So we would love to see that trend continue as more states take these on. And then some states, it's very varied. So some states allow them to be requested for any type of legislation, which is really great as well. And other states partner with universities to assist in conducting the assessments, which can lessen the burden on legislative research departments and provide access to data that is relevant to the assessment, which Kelsey will dive into later, why that's so important to have really great data for these. And then, though not required by law, the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission does use racial equity impact statements. They have tried to make that law, but it hasn't been successful. So hopefully Minnesota can get that codified soon. So it is something that is required. And then we've also seen several local government bodies adopt the use of racial equity impact assessments. And in particular, we want to highlight Illinois, who has had success recently in passing a racial equity impact assessment law. So one of our partner organizations, Voices for Illinois Children, was really instrumental in getting that passed in Illinois. So we're really happy that they were there to advocate for that. But one of the barriers that was cited most by lawmakers was not having the data to conduct a racial equity impact assessment, which is incredibly important to making sure that you understand the issues that different groups are facing. So to combat this concern, the Voices group proposed expanding the data collection and reporting capacity of state agencies. That way they would have more data to call upon for these equity analyses. So prior to this law, only the Department of Health and Human Services was collecting data that was disaggregated by race. The bill expanded that requirement to other state agencies, such as the State Board of Ed and other human services agencies. And then they were able to safely, reasonably conduct these racial equity impact assessments with great data to call upon. So that was passed in April of 2021. Next, I'm going to pass it over to Ashley to talk more about what Virginia has done recently.
Great, thanks for that background, Katie. So TCI first approached Delegate Raceford in 2020, and we worked with her on legislation that would require racial equity impact assessments for proposed legislation in Virginia. We took a very broad approach, and we weren't able to get the traction that we were hoping for that session, but Delegate Aird is persistent, and she planned to reintroduce the measure in 2021. Then the George Floyd tragedy happened, and the summer uprisings, and there was now a huge spotlight on criminal justice policy and the need for reform. So we reconsidered our legislation, we reworked the proposal, we talked to experts like the folks at the Sentencing Project and refined the legislation to be specifically focused on criminal justice policy. I was then able to organize a coalition of 15 organizations across the state who supported the legislation, connected with lawmakers, and testified in committee during the 2021 legislative session. And in the end, the General Assembly passed House Bill 1990, which allows for the chair of the House Committee for Courts of Justice and the chair of the Senate Committee on the Judiciary to request a racial and ethnic impact statement for up to 6 total bills, 3 in each chamber. And then the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, also known as JLARC, is the agency then responsible for completing the statements and getting the information back to the lawmakers before they make a decision on if a bill should move forward. I'm really proud of this legislation. It's a huge step towards equity in Virginia public policy. And in the future, racial and ethnic impact statements in Virginia could be expanded to include any proposed legislation or a greater number of issue areas in addition to criminal justice legislation. So many issues, including tax, budget, revenue issues, are not race neutral issues. It could also be expanded to a greater number of proposed bills as opposed to just 6. And it could also be expanded to provide analysis of more demographics, for example, gender disparities. But again, this is all really new, and I think the first step is just to roll out the current process in 2022 to ensure that these statements are first being used, but also to assess JLARC's ability to produce the assessments and really just learn before making any additional changes to the law so that whatever changes we do make in the future are useful and productive. And now I'll turn it back to Katie, who will talk about the framework for putting an impact assessment together.
So this framework that we're going to look at today is from Raceford to show how they would recommend that organizations use racial equity impact assessments. Very important to note is that these can be kind of changed, moved around, changed to fit organizational needs, but these general ideas should stay within any successful racial equity impact assessment. So obviously very important is to identify and engage stakeholders. So this is going to be the piece where you're going to actually go out and speak to the communities that are impacted by potential policies, figure out what's going on, how potential policies will affect them. And that's really important to kind of get the lay of the land, figure out what may happen if you do pass a policy. And it's really important to do this in a very meaningful way so that you're getting great information to back up why your policy should or shouldn't happen, and to maybe potentially change your policy if there are any like big things that will like put burdens on different communities. Then it's important to make sure that you understand the purpose of your proposed legislation and program to make sure that the actual policy will achieve that goal in an equitable fashion. It's important to examine the alternatives and improvements, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later with our examples, why it's important to make sure that you can change your policy, you're going to be very flexible. And then lastly, I want to highlight just the importance of ensuring viability and sustainability if this is going to be a positive program, because you want to make sure that you have the resources to support these communities. If it is going to have a very positive impact, you want to make sure that it can last a long time and have that positive impact on the communities. But like I said, this framework can be adjusted as needed to fit organizational needs, and other organizations have different frameworks, but this is kind of the gold standard. So we wanted to highlight it today if any organizations want to take these on for internal use. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about how organizations have used racial equity impact assessments internally. So governmental bodies are not the only ones who can use these assessments as a tool to assess their policies and programs. It's really important for organizations to be aware of how their goals, their programs are meeting their equity goals. So one example that we wanted to highlight is the Nellie Mae Foundation. This is an article that they posted to talk about their process of going through an equity assessment. They're an organization that awards grants to increase access to equitable student-centered learning in the New England public education system. So when they conducted an internal racial equity impact analysis, they found that their organizational structure was actually preventing them from integrating equity in all of their work, and that they needed to restructure to meet their goals. They also were able to see some of the gaps that they had in their current programming, and they were able to reimagine their grant awarding process with equity at the center. We really appreciate them posting their findings publicly to be transparent about their process towards reaching equity and prioritizing that in all of the work that they do, making sure they're really looking critically at their internal work and not just assuming that they're achieving equity because they say that they are. So I think it's really important for organizations to do this work internally to make sure that their programs are succeeding at their goals. But next we will hear about the TCI process of conducting racial equity impact assessments from Ashley.
Great. So as Katie mentioned, racial equity impact assessments are important tools for legislative work, and similar analysis should be implemented in all areas of public policy to ensure that the centering of racial equity in research and advocacy and outreach and data collection, et cetera. Next slide, please. So TCI staff fill out a racial equity assessment for every research product that we release. This ensures that our organizational values are represented in our work and that we are continuously assessing whether our own policy recommendations promote equity. Next slide. Some of the questions we ask on our assessment tool includes, what are the race equity implications of the policy issue? What contributing or compounding factors are leading to the racial inequities? What data analysis will the report that we're writing be using? And what analysis will pertain explicitly to racial equity? Looking closely at the data is so critically important because so much of people's experiences and lives are not even captured in the data due to small sample sizes or just the lack of collection of certain information section of our presentation. So this is an example of an assessment that was completed for a blog post that we wrote about tax conformity issue earlier this year. And it's evidence that even something that may seemingly be race neutral on its face could actually have unintended or intended consequences for people of color. Virginia had to decide whether or not to conform to a federal tax provision around Paycheck Protection Program loans that would have given a double tax benefit to many people who received those loans. Our research, we learned that not at TCI, we think it's really important to do this work, to do these assessments, to self-assess, to check our own blind spots and our own privilege. It's necessary for centering equity in our policy recommendations and to ultimately live up to our mission to advance racial and economic equity. And now I'll turn it over to Kelsey.
Thanks, Ashley. So today I'm going to be presenting on the importance of data in racial equity impact assessments and how it can be used to inform policy advocacy and policy solutions. So my goals for today are to describe the data used in racial equity impact assessments to get a better understanding of the difference between equality and equity, to understand the importance of data disaggregations and data framing, and also to identify key uses of this data for legislators, organizations, and the state. All right, so our data and research program utilizes population level data to describe what's happening to Virginia's children. This means that the data is typically secondary, so we don't collect it ourselves. Data serves many different purposes: to describe, inform, educate, and persuade others to take action on today's most important topics. We can use it to track progress, identify trends, evaluate impact, determine barriers, and expose disparities. While data can be a great tool, it's not the final answer. Data typically helps us ask more questions about what's happening in a community and often doesn't provide any direct answers. So next slide, please. All right, so now let's discuss equality versus equity. Across the nation, gaps in health are large, persistent, and increasing. Many of them are caused by barriers that exist at all levels of our society. It's hard to be healthy without access to good jobs, high-quality schools, and safe, affordable homes. Health equity means increasing opportunities for everyone to live the healthiest life possible, no matter who we are, where we live, or how much money we make. The difference between equality and equity is that equality is sameness, while equity is fairness. So take a look at the graphic here. The first picture represents inequality. Only one child is receiving a fallen apple, which represents unequal access to opportunity. The next picture represents equality, in which both children are given a ladder of the exact same height to reach the apples. The tools and the assistance are evenly distributed, but still both children are not receiving what they need. The third picture represents equity, in which both children receive custom tools that address the inequality. One receives a taller ladder so they can both reach the apples. But the picture that truly gets to the root of the problem is the last picture, representing justice. It shows proactively straightening the tree and therefore fixing the system in order to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities before equity measures are even needed. Next slide, please. So the equality versus equity graphic is a really great example of why it's important to break down data. As child advocates who care about the well-being of every child, we have to look at subpopulations of children to make sure that, in fact, all children are doing well. It's important that we look at data for subpopulations who often have trends that are masked by larger groups to make sure that resources are being spent on those who need it most. A problem with this is that people are afraid that if we break down data, that the differences will result in blame being put on the affected families instead of where blame should be placed, which is on the structures that have shaped that outcome. So as an example of breaking down data, let's take a look at life expectancy. So county health rankings and the Center on Society and Health have done numerous studies and research into this topic in Richmond, Virginia. There are huge differences in years between many groups. In Virginia, the life expectancy is about 79.4 years. If we drill down smaller to Richmond City, that decreases to about 77.2 years. But not everyone in Richmond City has the opportunity to live to 77 years old. Hispanic people on average in Richmond City can expect to live to almost 89 years, but Black people on average expect to live to about 73 years in Richmond. If we only looked at Richmond as a whole, it's much harder to see the racial and ethnic differences that are so important here. Next slide, please. So here's another life expectancy map. Looking into even smaller geographies, those living within Richmond have an even wider range of life expectancy. Within Richmond, those living just a few miles apart can have as much of a difference as 23 years, ranging from 63 years in Gilpin Court to 83 years in Westover Hills. Again, this is just hugely important not to overgeneralize Richmond when we have such striking differences between these two areas. All right, so we've seen what data disaggregation and framing entails. So now let's just look at what this broken down data has to offer. There are many different ways that the data in racial equity impact assessments can be used by legislators and community members. So firstly, the data can be used to identify how health disparities in a community affect specific groups. This can be used in the creation and advocacy of policy. Legislators can also use this data to better understand the best ways to respect people of all groups and make efforts to involve all groups in enacting change. It can be used to consider opportunities to engage impactive perspectives in shaping policies as well. The data can also be used to analyze a bill's potential impact on economic, social, physical, or health outcomes for specific groups. And also it can be used to frequently evaluate how well policies that are aimed at health equity are working and how they can be used to answer the question, who benefits from this and who is burdened by this, by proposed policy and changes that can be made when necessary to ensure these policies are most effective. And that's going to be it for my portion of the presentation. Thanks for listening. And now I'll just turn it back over to Ashley and Katie.
All right, so next we want to talk about and highlight one aspect of conducting a racial equity impact assessment from the Raceford framework. This will be the second step, engaging with impacted voices and impacted communities, making sure that you're hearing from real people to understand the issue, understand the barriers, and changing your policy accordingly. So this is really important because it's the only way that you're going to hear the real story, or it's the only way you're going to get behind like what's actually happening and be able to fix the problem. So for governmental bodies, this may mean hosting additional listening sessions, public hearings, reaching out to constituents, or even just reaching out to the community organizations that work with impacted voices that you want to hear from, because that can be like a trusted conduit between those people and the governmental bodies. For organizations who are doing this work directly, it's really important to just build trust in the communities that you're serving so that people can share openly. There's one example that I want to highlight from Seattle where they had some issues with burnt out streetlights in certain communities that just weren't being reported. So they found, after speaking to the community, that there was just a lot of distrust in the way that the city was like maybe collecting that information. They didn't want to take advantage of the online reporting tool. So instead, they just started automatically replacing the streetlights, making the communities a little bit safer. And that changed the way that they functioned in a lot of the work that the city did, so that they could just kind of good over that barrier of people not trusting the city and start performing those services for them. So this is really important to actively engage with the communities that you want to serve, to figure out how you can better serve them as a policymaker, and to use the information that you learn to shape your assessment and ultimately the policy decision that you make. So Ashley, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was really great, and I completely agree that trust and relationship building is really really important in that regard. One thing that we do at TCI is to ask our partners to read and to provide feedback on our research products before we publish them, and not just our state level partners like Voices, who we really love and admire, but grassroots partners, people who would be directly impacted by the policy solutions that we propose. But we also strive to consult with people before we even write a policy blog post or a paper. And a good example of this is a paper we published earlier this year on the disproportionate impact of criminal fines and fees on Black people in Virginia. And early in the process of researching for that report, we had several listening sessions with people who were formerly incarcerated and directly experiencing the impact of fines and fees. And those conversations are really what led to the policy solutions that we proposed in our paper, and ultimately the legislation that was later introduced during the General Assembly session. So essentially, we create a feedback loop at TCI, and that loop really does rely on the trust and the relationship building that you were mentioning, Katie.
Okay, and next we just want to go into some additional resources for any organizations that are looking to start taking on racial equity impact assessments in their work. There's a really great report from the Annie E. Casey Foundation that details why these assessments are important, and it includes 2 case studies of assessments in action, like the Seattle one that I mentioned earlier. We also have a guide to using child impact assessments in your community from the Kids Impact Initiative. So that will show you how to prioritize child welfare and policymaking. And then lastly, we wanted to highlight a guide to beginning a racial equity assessment for potential child welfare policies from the Center for the Study of Social Policies. So all of these will be a great way to start your process towards integrating these assessments into your work. So next, I will pass it back to Emily to talk about Voices and their equity impact statements.
Thanks, Katie, and we'll drop all of those links in the chat so folks can grab those directly while you're following along here and look at these other examples about how they may apply to your organization or your work. So Voices produced our first equity impact statements that were complementary to our policy agenda materials this past year. And you can find these on our website. We'll drop a link in for these as well. And so you can see here, I tried to highlight and do some screenshots where you can see where data came into play as we used that information to frame the issue and to point out where children of color are disproportionately represented or overrepresented in any systems, and where disparities may begin so that we can begin addressing that in policies. We connected with those impacted groups to provide context. In this case, we have a number of policy networks that help to shape our policy agenda each year, made up of professionals as well as young people who have been a part of the foster care system, who serve on our foster care policy cohort that help to shape that information and provide their perspective on what's most important and how they feel about the system after participating in the foster care system. And so we try to engage those various stakeholders to help inform that perspective, as well as other stakeholders who may be involved in implementing the policies or may want to be informed in better understanding how equity and some questions that they may or may not have asked about equity are impacting the policy proposals. So we also bring that information to other groups, other coalitions, associations, advocacy networks, in this case, social services executives, foster care providers, LGBTQ advocates and others to help better understand the impact of the proposed policies. And then we outlined some specific policies, and these that related to our policy agenda the last year, and how any specific policy can better help to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities or to dismantle those systems that have created the disparity. So I think we have some time here, about 15 minutes or so, for some questions too. So I want to make sure we've got some questions in advance from folks that want to weigh in on how to use some of these policy statements. So I'm going to ask each of you, really appreciate all of the valuable information that you've shared, Ashley and TCI, for blazing the trail with the legislation in Virginia and the good work that you just put into your blogs every day to make sure that we all see this information. Katie, UVA grad student that was with us for the summer, and Kelsey, graduate of Virginia Tech that continues to work with us. Thank you all for sharing your awesome information. So I do have a couple of questions. And Ashley, I'm going to start with you as you think about working in the world of other nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, and legislative agencies. Are there benefits for each of those groups to producing the equity impact statements? And is it helpful for legislators and advocates to see organizational impact statements as well as those that may be produced by JLARC or the legislative entities?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Emily. A state agency may have more resources at their disposal and therefore more information, or at least access to get the information that would be helpful in the creation of these statements. And of course, JLARC has staff that are well-versed in Virginia policy, as well as completing similar assessments. So they have all of the tools at their disposal. That being said, I think lawmakers should rely on all of the available tools before making policy decisions that will ultimately impact the lives of so many people in Virginia. So at TCI, we often do a racial equity assessment of the state budget, for example, and with our goal of being more actively engaged with impacted communities and community-led organizations, our take on the equity implications of the budget may provide a different perspective than a state agency's take. And so that's why I think it's really critically important for lawmakers to use all of those tools before they make their decisions.
Yeah, and I can imagine that for some state agencies, the ability to connect to those informed populations or to have the trust of the populations and stakeholders that need to weigh in, it may not be as strong as some of the nonprofit groups and other advocacy organizations too. So that's the key element of building that system. Kelsey, I wanted to ask you, so from our data analysis perspective here, are there different types of data that lend itself to analysis for equity impact statements? And what are some of the sources that you can look at to find that data disaggregated by race and ethnicity that we know can be really hard to find?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say that disaggregated data lends itself best to equity impact statements. The more we can break down data to be more specific, the more we can see specific subgroups of children that may otherwise be overlooked. And at Voices, we're home to the Kids Count Data Center, which is a database of all types of data related to child, youth, and family well-being in areas like poverty, education, health, and a bunch more. And we collect data over time from places like state agencies, like the Department of Health or Social Services, but also from other online sources of data, like the Census and Feeding America. So we have hundreds of indicators at the state and data at the local level as well. And we also have the ability to disaggregate this data, which is really important, like I've discussed, by groups like race, age, and poverty status. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Can I just add one thing in there, that when it's important that when you're not able to disaggregate the data, that's an opportunity for advocacy, to call out for the better collection of data so that we can do the important research that's so needed. So that's just another point.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
So I will mention that on the Kids Count Data Center on our website, which we'll put a link to, under each subsection, so family stability, economic security and poverty, there is a section of indicators that are broken down by race and ethnicity, where you can use the data and look at it by those race and ethnic categories. Well, one other caveat here is that the data and information is available in how it was collected by the agency, and race and ethnicity data is not always collected consistently or using the same terms for that information, same language across the system. So we report it as it was collected in that system. So you may not always be able to have an apples to apples comparison, particularly with ethnicities like Hispanic, non-Hispanic in our data. We do the best that we can to provide you with what is available and how it was collected, and try to advocate for additional opportunities for that and better data collection too. But we'll put a link right in here where you can see how to access that information disaggregated by race. Most of our data is also available at the locality level. So you can drill down to your specific community and see how it compares to other neighboring communities or the rest of the state as well. Get excited talking about the data. All right, Katie, get our last question here. So do you have an example or story? I mean, you shared the one about the Nellie Mae internally and how it shaped the organization. Is there another example that you can think of that shaped a policy proposal or outcome at the legislative level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so glad you asked, because I have another example from the Annie Casey Foundation with their case studies. So the Minneapolis School Board was looking at some ways that they could reduce the costs because they were seeing decreasing enrollment. So they're looking at maybe cutting down some school locations and their transportation options, but they wanted to conduct a racial equity impact assessment to make sure that they were doing that in an equitable way. So with this racial equity impact assessment, they analyzed 3 different cost-cutting options and found that the option that would save the most money and have the least disruptions overall would have a disproportionate impact on Somali and Native American students. So in response to this finding, they began to engage with the Somali and Native American communities to figure out how they could reduce those negative impacts, to figure out what the story was behind it, how they could maybe change their plan to make sure that they were not putting that unnecessary burden on those students. So after hearing what the communities said, they adjusted the plans to fit the needs of those 2 communities and found a plan that was both cost effective and promoted equity. So we really applaud them for that work. And that's just an example of how local entities, city governments can use racial equity impact assessments to make sure that their plans promote equity while also being reasonable for what they're trying to do. So it's a great example of good policy work.
Awesome, thanks, Katie. So do you all have anything else to ask questions of each other or points that we might have missed about racial equity impact assessment? I think you all did a really awesome job of helping to see how these equity impact statements can be used to make them real, to appeal to the policy wonks out there in the world who we all love and cherish, to keep doing this kind of work and analysis to ensure that there is more equitable opportunities for children and families in Virginia. So I really appreciate everyone for doing this work and continuing to keep it front and center. I'm going to pull back up the screen just to say thank you to our colleagues here at the Commonwealth Institute, and make sure that you have ways to connect with Ashley and her colleagues at the Commonwealth Institute. Find them online with the blogs that she mentioned. Follow on Twitter, and Facebook. And Ashley, there's your contact info. Thank you so much for being part of this presentation today and really blazing the trail in Virginia on introducing this as legislation and embedding it within your organization. So thank you. And connect with us at Voices throughout this week for Racial Truth and Reconciliation. There are other components of this policy analysis and data analysis track that will be happening throughout the week, as well as other opportunities, listening sessions and roundtables, some opportunities to engage with your children and families in some fun activities as well. So check out our website and what is to come. Tomorrow we have the governor and members of his cabinet talking about the work of Virginia to transform its focus on equity and what's ahead, hopefully from the next phase in Virginia. So tune into that panel presentation tomorrow for other folks who want to embrace more of this policy and analysis in our future work for children of Virginia. So I hope you can find more information here. Really appreciate everyone listening in today and for your questions. And we hope that you will find this information useful and impactful in your advocacy and in your personal life. Thank you so much.